bed watching one of his favourite TV programmes, Fox and Friends. They're covering an NHS rally that happened in London over the weekend. Then Nigel Farage, former leader of UKIP, the well-known media pundit who's very much admired by Donald Trump, pops up to say that the NHS is under pressure because of too much immigration. So far, so predictable. But guess what happened next? Donald Trump took to Twitter, of course, as he often does while lying in bed, to say the Democrats are pushing for universal health care while thousands of people are marching in the UK because their universal system is going broke and not working. As you can imagine, that caused quite a stir on this side of the pond. The Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, tweeted this in response. I may disagree with claims made on that march, but not one of them wants to live in a system where 28 million people have no cover. And that sentiment was echoed across the political spectrum. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said Donald Trump was wrong. People were marching because we love our NHS and hate what the Tories are doing to it. Healthcare is a human right. And the issue was also addressed in the House of Commons yesterday by the Shadow Health Secretary, Labour's John Ashworth.
On Saturday, thousands of us took to the streets to demand a fully funded, universal, public national health service. And by the way, we'll take no lessons from Donald Trump, who wants to deny healthcare to millions with a system that checks your purse before it checks your pulse. The NHS model isn't broke, but it does need funding. If this government won't give it the funding it needs, then the next Labour government will.
John Ashworth in the Commons. And joining me now is Mike Tanner, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, which is a free market think tank based in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the programme. As you heard there, hopefully, politicians across the political spectrum here in the UK are very keen to condemn the American system and say it's much worse than the British NHS model. Are they right?
Well, the fact is that the U.S. system has a great many problems. Although the U.S. system is hardly the Wild West of free market systems that I think that many in the UK believe. More than half of healthcare spending in the United States comes from the federal government. And most of the rest of healthcare spending is subsidized by the government in some way. The entire system is regulated from the top down. And so there's very little actual free market competition in the U.S. system. Right,
but the Labour Shadow Health Secretary John Ashworth says that in America the basic principle is you check your purse before they check your pulse. And the Conservative Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt says no one here wants to live under a system where 28 million people have no cover. I mean, those are fair points, aren't they?
Well, the fact is that everybody in the United States has at least emergency care, and that the poorest in the United States have government-subsidized health care through our Medicaid system. Now, there are certainly problems with some people not being able to afford health care, but simply giving people a piece of paper that says that everyone has health care is no guarantee to access either. We know that in the UK, for example, access to specialty care is often delayed far too long, and that means that many of the outcomes are not as good as they otherwise could be.
Right, well, outcomes is one thing, but access is another. And in terms of access, there are many reports around the world that say the NHS is the best healthcare system, certainly compared to the US.
Well, in terms of access, it all depends on what you mean by access. Do you have access to specialty care or to initial care? And outcomes is ultimately what healthcare is all about. And the fact is that, for example, in terms of cancer survivability rates, the UK does not do nearly as well.
Right. Justine Greening, why are politicians here so sensitive about criticism about the NHS?
I think the NHS is something that we all rely on for our healthcare, and it's actually quite an intrinsic part of what our country is, and in a sense how we feel about the fact that it shouldn't matter who you are, you can have access to healthcare. You referred to what I think is the Commonwealth Fund report that the OECD commissioned, that actually said that the NHS also has better health outcomes overall than the
There are
US.
other reports that say that our outcomes aren't as good in terms of delivery on things like cancer care survival rates.
Absolutely, and I don't think anybody is saying that the NHS is perfect. That's the debate we're having in our country at the moment, is how can we catch up on some of the areas we need to, but also make sure that it can do as well in the 21st century for our country as it's been able to do in the 20th century. Right,
but was it right for Jeremy Hunt to respond to Donald Trump over the NHS?
I think Donald Trump is a man who routinely tweets. He is president of the United States at the moment, and he will continue to tweet, I think, after he stopped being president.
Shouldn't Jeremy Hunt have risen above it then?
Well, I think it's up to Jeremy how he wants to respond, but I don't think any of us should be particularly surprised that Donald Trump continues to tweet, and I've no doubt that the Daily Politics will be able to report in future programmes on more Donald Trump tweets on various issues.
But you've just heard what Mike Tanner says. There are criticisms about the NHS, the British healthcare system too. Are you saying that politically they cannot take that sort of criticism, or at least feed it into the debate about how to improve the NHS?
I think Donald Trump will do his tweets. I think the most important thing is the debate that we have here in the United Kingdom about what kind of an NHS we want, how we can make sure it remains accessible and free at the point of delivery, but how it also more fundamentally adapts to the fact that people are living longer, we can treat people for more things, that all costs more money, and we need to make sure that we have an NHS that is properly funded and effective in providing treatment for people who rely on it, which is basically all of us.
Right. I mean, Mike Tanner, how do US politicians broadly view the NHS here?
Well, I think the NHS is something of a boogeyman in the United States. We tend to think of the NHS and equate it with rationing and poor care, some of which is driven by horror stories that are not particularly true or that often are exaggerated. But the fact is, the NHS is a model for how the fact that simply spending more money is not going to yield better outcomes. You've essentially doubled in the last 2 decades as the percent of health care as a percentage of GDP spent in the UK. And during the period when you were really raising that, during the last Labour government, you saw almost no increases in efficiency or improvement in outcomes.
Right.
So it's not a case of simply spending more money.
No, but you spend a lot more money in the US, don't you? And as you say, in terms of access and even on some areas of delivery, it doesn't actually prove to be a winning health system.
No, spending more money is not always the answer, although I will say that the U.S. spends more money largely because of our larger GDP per capita. In fact, we're pretty much exactly where you'd predict. Healthcare economists would say is a superior good, which means as your incomes rise as a country, you tend to spend more money on it.
Right. I mean, the former Conservative Chancellor, Justine Greening, Nigel Lawson, said the NHS is the closest thing the English people have to a religion. Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't think we do political religion, but it is pretty close to that. And I think that's because it is so fundamental. You can't have a healthy economy unless you have healthy people. And I think the debate we're having right now focuses on really 3 areas. One is how can the NHS cope with the fluctuations in year, like
well, does it need to put more money in then?
How does it cope with these more underlying issues, like the fact we're living longer and can be treated for more? And in the end of the day, how do you tilt it towards focusing on prevention? So actually, fundamentally, as a healthcare system, it works efficiently. And that isn't just in terms of money, but actually it keeps people healthier so that we don't have so many people getting unnecessary diseases and treatments.
Well, you heard from Mike Tanner that money isn't necessarily the silver bullet. What do you say to Nigel Farage that say actually the system is creaking because of high levels of immigration?
I think the NHS's challenges are far more fundamental. We have a growing population in this country, irrespective of the immigration pressures. The fact that we are leaving the EU means that we will have full control over levels of immigration coming into our country in the future. And I think that's a simple distraction, frankly, from the more complex challenges that the NHS faces.
But is he right? Has he got a point?
I think we've had a lot of immigration into the UK, but I don't particularly feel that that is the key to unlocking how the NHS needs to reform going forward to make sure it remains a national health service that all of us can rely on.
Right, and just finally, Mike Tanner, is it convenient for Donald Trump to use our NHS to beat up the Democrats in America?
Well, politically, it's very helpful. But, you know, Donald Trump will have a new tweet or a new tantrum tomorrow, and we'll be moving on to another issue. So it's not something that's going to sustain the political debate for very long. But the fact is that both the U.S. and the U.K. health systems could benefit from a healthy degree of free market competition that both are lacking.
Right. Do you agree with that?
Not really. No, I think we have a sensible model in the UK. And I think it is broadly value for money. And I think
even though the Tories are the great sort of champions of free market.
Well, we actually passed an NHS bill that absolutely limited any Secretaries of State ability to privatise the NHS. It was a Conservative government that did that. So now I think we've got a good model. It's about how we make sure it adapts and evolves to the challenges that we face today.
Mike Tanner, thank you.